Hello and welcome. I'm Koojcast, and this is my Elden Ring PvP parry guide. As a preface, I'd like to mention unparryable attacks and movesets. I'm still not fully aware of what is and is not parryable, so I've been operating off of Dark Souls 3 rules. What that means is that jump attacks are not parryable, except maybe the Scythe. I'm not sure. Some Ashes of War may be parryable, but I haven't tried it as it is extremely high risk. And some Ashes of War may become parryable when done without any FP, and again, I don't know that for sure. The colossal weapons, when two-handed, are very likely unparryable. Some melee spells are parryable, and spell parry shields can deflect ranged spells, and of course whips and flails cannot be parried. A good chunk of this is not 100% confirmed. I'm just operating off previous experience and how the other games worked. So I'm super open to being wrong on any of this, and if anyone knows of any resources regarding what is and is not parryable, any testing someone's done, please send it my way. So, aside from that, I would also like to make note of a couple terms I'll be using throughout the video. Any fighting game players will immediately know what I'm talking about. These terms are neutral, advantage, and disadvantage. This refers to the current state of interaction between you and other PvP participants. So, neutral is when no players have any advantage. You're basically poking at each other, seeing what you can get away with. You are in a state of advantage when you strike an opponent and are applying pressure, and you are in a state of disadvantage when you are struck and are attempting to avoid pressure. This is important because people behave much differently in each state. For example, many summoned phantoms become overconfident in a state of advantage, perhaps also due to their increased numbers, maybe 2 or 3 to 1 against you, and thus they attack more freely. This may make it easier to get a parry. It may also make it easier to get put in the blender. Likewise, getting parries from a state of advantage may be rarer, because the act of you pressuring your opponent often promotes the use of defensive tactics, such as rolling. Although some people do like to R1 as a get-out-of-my-face tool, so that's on an individual basis. Now, switching from advantage to disadvantage can happen at a moment's notice, and we must be prepared to adapt accordingly. I'd also like to stress the importance of being perceptive and picking up on people's habits, as these patterns can often be exploited to your benefit. This is also related to the concept of conditioning, which is when you establish a pattern for someone to punish, and usually you'll change your tactics to counter their punish. So I'm going to be reviewing and breaking down some of my PvP footage as a means to provide examples, and I'll try to point out these practices and specific parry techniques along the way. Lastly, when parrying people online, you need to parry about a half a second in advance because of the built-in latency of playing online. Now, with that having been said, we're going to switch over to learning some parry techniques. Well, let's begin. So here I'm going to point out immediately that I am in neutral when I spawn. And you're generally going to be in neutral before you fight someone unless you manage to sneak up and backstab them or maybe get a spell off when they're not paying attention. These would be the only ways you might start a fight in advantage. Otherwise, you're probably going to see each other. You're going to be in a state of neutral. You're going to throw out attacks. Might be like, we call it a poke. So check and see what they are ready to deal with. Check and see what you can get away with. Here I get 2 hits, roll away to neutral because I want to avoid the punish from the Great Hammer. And then I miss space and I start eating attacks. I'm in disadvantage here, so I roll away to reset to neutral and heal. And this is where they press their advantage. Now the host, he decides to go for a roll attack. It's not something he had done prior, so there was no pattern and I didn't condition him into it. But I predicted that he was going to roll attack based on his movement, and I got the parry. So, reading someone's movement is incredibly important if you're going to try and predictive parry people, because you need to try and understand what their intentions are in the moment there. So this one here, this is going to be called a setup parry. So you block 1, parry the 2nd. You may block 2 hits and parry the 3rd, or 3 and the 4th. It will really depend upon which weapon they're actually using. Now the setup parry has been around since Demon Souls, I think, and I learned it in Dark Souls, but the basic idea is you can keep your shield up, you can maintain defense, and you can get that parry out without leaving yourself too open. It also makes it significantly easier to time the parry because well, let's face it, it's a lot harder to get a parry when someone just walks up to you and you parry their first strike. But if someone is consistently swinging, so there's like a cadence to the way they swing the R1s, then it's a lot easier to time that. And additionally, you get feedback when they hit your shields. So I find setup parries to be one of the easier forms of parries to get. However, they're only really going to work on people who don't know about setup parries, or maybe they get overzealous in their attacking. Because more veteran players who are familiar with setup parries, they just won't attack immediately. They won't immediately fall on. So this here is a good example of advantage state. That guy just kept rolling, so I kept pressuring him. If he would have tried to attack or something, he could have maybe switched out of disadvantage. He could have made it his turn. But I kept pressuring him and I maintained my advantage state, and so it just kept being my turn. Now in this one, there's something a little different. This is something I call a buffer parry. Now buffer refers to a stored input. So if you're stuck in an animation and then you press a button, the buffer will play that animation after your current animation. So in this case here, approach this guy, and he wants to R1 me, and he's doing a follow-up R1 as well, so he's hit R1 at least twice, maybe more. So I hit him, I stagger him, and then I parry him there. Because when you stagger someone like that and they buffer an R1, the R1 comes out at the exact same time every time. This makes it a very consistent and predictable way to get a parry. So this is the buffer parry. So coming up next here, we've got another predictive parry. Essentially what happens is I eat a bunch of hits and I'm close to dying, and I roll away to reset to neutral and heal, which, as you may have noticed, is a bit of a trend. Swinging things from disadvantage to advantage can be really good. Particularly parrying is good at that, is what I mean to say, because it can make up for a large deficit in damage very quickly. So as you can see, I'm trying to like stagger and buffer parry these guys. They've both got big weapons, so they're not having any of it. It's not really working very well. And I'm about to eat a couple more hits here, and see, this is where I disengage. We're gonna heal. The host starts sprinting, so I read his movement, and I get a predictive parry on his sprint attack. Sprint attacks, aside from roll attacks, are one of the other easier ones to predictive parry, just because you can see them start the sprint animation, and then you know roughly when the attack's going to come out if you're familiar with the weapon. Just as with the roll attack, the attack always comes after the roll. So next up here, something I might call like a tank parry. And this was a very common thing to do in Dark Souls 3 and in Dark Souls Remaster. Essentially what it is you get hit by 1 or 2 strikes, and then you parry the follow-up. So in Dark Souls 3, super common. You get hit by 2 straight sword R1s, and you parry the third. It's just like how that game worked. In this one here, he does a roll attack with his straight sword, and then I parry the follow-up with that. Now, this exact thing, tanking a roll attack and then parrying the follow-up R1, happened in Dark Souls 3 as well, so I was already familiar with this concept as well. Now, tank parries, regarding like getting hit by 2 straight swords and parrying the third, or maybe 2 rapier hits and parrying the third, or anything like that, is extremely inconsistent in Elden Ring and should be used with great caution. It does not work the same as it did in other games. I would refrain from using this if at all possible, just because it is not very consistent. So as you can see, I'm trading with these guys a lot. I'm trying to do the buffer parry on them. It's not necessarily panning out. The katana's sort of a weird one for that, where it seems to actually get a little bit of super armor or something. But as you can see there, I got one of the strikes and staggered him. However, while I would consider this still a buffer parry, we actually traded. So I suppose if you wanted to call it a trade parry or something, you could. But it operates on the same basic principle where you stagger them and they buffer the animation. It's just that I got hit also, but unfortunately my stagger didn't last long enough for me to get hit by the full-up strike or anything. Now this may or may not work depending on the weapon, like maybe great weapons or something like that might not necessarily work with, because they have the poise, they have like armor on startup essentially. So again, it's dependent on whether or not you are able to stagger them. Alright, next up we have 2 guys with great swords here. So once again, I'm trying to test out that buffer parry, and I'm kind of throwing out checks on them and seeing what happens, but it seems like they've either got poise or it's hyper armor on startup, in addition to my misspacing, and it's not really working out for me. So with that in mind, I'm like, alright, great swords are relatively easy to set up here, so maybe we change our strategy here. And sure enough, the host wants to do a run attack into the follow-up R1, which also works for setup parries. In some of the previous games, you could also tank a run attack and then parry the follow-up R1, as we did with the roll attack in the other clip there. I don't know if that works in this game or not. It seems like sprint attacks may deal more stagger than they had in previous games, but I'm not entirely certain on that one. So in this one here, I'm just going to try and use the trees as cover for my buff initially because of the weird trajectory of that spell, which just makes me want to highlight the importance of situational awareness and using your environment, particularly as an invader. If you can back someone off a ledge or something and they fall to their death, or push them back into enemies and other things like that, as well as just like using a wall. If someone's shooting a bunch of spells at you, just go stand behind a tree or a wall, and it is no big deal. They just won't hit you. And once again here, if I go back, I tried to do a setup parry on the host here. I tried to block 2 straight sword R1s and then parry the third. But he didn't do the third. He did a charged R2, so I wouldn't have parried him, and I also ate a spell to the face. So between the two of them, that was like a pretty good punish on me. However, he repeats a predictable action there. So if we go back a bit, you can see he does his melee strike in just a moment here, and he loops around and he does it again. So just based on reading his movement, I thought that he was going to attack like that again, and it got me the parry. Now, he could have been doing a completely different action. He could have shot at me and I would have just taken the damage. However, that's not how this one worked out. So, final clip here is a little bit different just because this host, I don't even hit him once, but he just immediately starts running. So he's ready to go into disadvantage state, I guess. You can see he's switching his weapons. He gets his swords out, tries to do a roll attack, and so I go for the buffer parry there on the R1. Doesn't work. We try it once more, and it does pan out because he's got dual swords. He wants to swing them. Now, just to do a quick recap, we've covered the buffer parry, which is when you strike someone and they buffer an input, and then you parry the follow-up. We've got the setup parry, where you block an attack, you parry a follow-up attack. We've got the predictive parry, where you try and read someone's movement and then take a stab at what option they're going to do and parry that. And of course we have the tank parry, where you get hit by a strike and then you parry a follow-up. Now this is by no means an exhaustive list of parry techniques. There's definitely many more, such as the Barker Bomb Bait, popular from Dark Souls 3. However, these are the ones I've covered today, and I would like to thank you all for watching. I hope this ups your parry game. Thanks and take care.